Hello and welcome to Taskmaster Talks with Kevin Sullivan. I'm your host, JP John Paz. Of course, joining me, the star of the show, the former WCW and ECW World Tag Team Champion, the man behind the 83 weeks of dominance, one of the greatest minds and bookers ever in the history of the business, the Games Master, the Taskmaster, the Devil himself, the original Devil himself, Mr. Kevin Sullivan. Kevin, how you doing today, sir?
I'm doing fine, and I want to I'll let you introduce our first guest, right? This is our first guest.
In a while, yeah, it's our first guest in a while, yeah. Mr. Matt Farmer from Defy Wrestling is joining us. Matt, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, guys. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's going to be fun.
And here's the thing: Matt runs one of the most successful wrestling companies, Defy. And one of the things I was lucky enough to work with them a couple of months ago, and it's the best locker room I've ever seen. And they don't pass out cakes to eat when they're doing their interviews. It was really a joy. And one of the other things about Matt, I know you know JP, he's one of the most foremost wrestling historians in the world. I mean, I've been a little bit of a story myself, but Matt's up there with Tom Burke and Jimmy Cornette, that's for sure.
Some high praise there.
Well, yeah, very high praise. Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate that. Yeah, man, yeah. I mean, geez, I love coming on podcasts and getting put over. No, but no, I do appreciate that, and thank you very much. I do spend a lot of time working on this business, this industry as a whole, and Defy. Thing about Defy is it's when people say it's a group effort, it really is a group effort. My partner Jim, who's the founder of Defy, we put in a lot of hours. Our crew puts in a lot of hours. We've got a great crew. We got a great staff. The talent that we bring into to the dressing rooms is great. And we make a concerted effort to work with people that are easy to work with. It makes the day and makes the product a lot more enjoyable when people are on the same page.
Exactly. And, JP, I got to meet Jim too. What a very nice guy. Very nice guy. And together, they're really good with Jim on the business side and Matt being the genius on the wrestling side. They're doing an incredible job. I mean, their shows are right up there with anybody's show today. And I don't mean just to say that it's the truth. They're bringing guys from all over. Plus, they have homegrown talent that's spectacular that will be on main companies' rosters sooner than later. That's for sure.
Big show coming up, right? 29.
We do, yes. This Saturday, October 29th, it's completely sold out. So it's only available on Fight pay-per-view, which is available like on Roku, Amazon Fire Stick, all that good stuff. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with Fight. So it's going to be available there at 8:00. The main event is Minoru Suzuki versus Tom Lawler, and everybody knows those guys are tough as nails. Suzuki's the founder of Pancrase. Tom fought in the UFC, so it's kind of like a battle of UFC versus Pancrase, which is going to be interesting. Suzuki was trained by guys like Carl Gotch and Billy Robinson, so you know how tough that guy is.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's going to be a really interesting match. I'm not sure of anything, but I would presume that this is the first time these guys have ever wrestled against one another in the U.S. Am I correct?
I believe so. I believe they have faced a few times in tag matches in Japan, but for singles matches, if it's not the first time, it's the second match they've had, and it would have been the first time since Tom's really grown a lot as a professional wrestler in terms of experience. They may have fought when he was really inexperienced as a pro wrestler. Don't quote me on that. I don't remember, but I believe it's one of the first times in a long time that they've faced each other.
Great.
With Minoru Suzuki, how does that go about? How do you get him in? Obviously, huge legend, New Japan Pro Wrestling still star. How did you get him to come in?
Well, we have a good relationship with New Japan Pro Wrestling, and in fact, we've promoted some New Japan, some New Japan Pro Wrestling events for them before, including one of their Super J Cup tournament shows. So, yeah, we've got a great relationship with New Japan, and that's how it worked out.
When you get guys like him and Ultimo Dragon, is that easy? Is that tough? Because it seems like, wow, like you're bringing in these awesome legends from Japan who don't necessarily work a lot in the States. I mean, they work some in the States, maybe now with New Japan Strong and stuff. But how does that all go about? Because I mean, you're bringing in some huge names through the Japanese circuit.
Yeah, some of the things that can be challenging is just travel for them, simply because if they're not, both Suzuki and Ultimo have been around the world, so they're not as challenging because they've been doing it for decades and have traveled as much as anybody ever, So they're easy to work with. You'll notice that with a lot of vets that have been doing it forever. You pretty much just tell them where they need to be and they'll be there if you give them a plane ticket. So they're not as challenging as others. Sometimes the language barrier can be an issue, but again, they're experienced, they're professionals, they know what they're doing. So it's really not as hard as it would sound. Some of the younger talent, like we have La Australia on the show, who is multilingual. He could speak multiple languages, but he's from Japan, who's spent a lot of his career in Mexico. Sometimes traveling in the U.S. could be a problem for him in terms of just getting around and little minutiae of the traveling. But once you build that relationship with those guys, they're great to work with.
What's going on with Ultimo? Who wrestles the tag match, right?
It is, yeah. So Ultimo, he's going to be teaming up with Nick Wayne, who's one of the fastest rising stars in wrestling right now. He's the grandson of Ed Moondog Moretti and the son of Buddy Wayne. And if anybody's been following like the local, not local indies, but the independent scene around the world, here's a 17-year-old kid who has been wrestling around the world. He just got back from his first tour of Japan. He just got back from the UK, and he's making a lot of he's actually signed to AEW at the age of 16. So he's got a lot of potential. So he's going to be teaming with Ultimo Dragon. They're going to be wrestling Gringo Loco and La Australia, who La Australia was an original student of Ultimo Dragon's with Dragon Gate, and Gringo Loco is one of the premier luchadors right now. So it's going to be a very interesting match.
That is great. And I know Kevin was talking about you guys have a lot of young, future stars, if you will. And Nick Wayne, that was the first guy I was thinking of. Like, man, how'd you guys find him though? Like, how did you get him? Because you guys were like the first ones really that kind of put him on the map.
Yeah, really. Well, so I've known Nick since he was a baby. I mean, I've known his dad and his grandfather. I wrestled both his grandfather and his dad. I'm really good friends with his mom. And so it's just something that I've known them forever. I've known Nick since he was a baby. And I've always kept in touch with Nick. Even our events in Seattle for the longest time were 21 and over. I would sneak Nick into the back dressing room just so he could hang around some of the wrestlers and participate, standing next to me, watching some of these guys come in and out, just to get the feel of it, because I knew he wanted to be a pro wrestler. And so he would be backstage, like at some of our events in Washington Hall at 10 years old,
Wow.
just seeing some of these guys. And it was something I did because I wanted, because he lost his father, unfortunately. And I knew he had a passion for the business. And I knew he would learn things from it by just being around some of these guys that have had this international experience or national experience, And never did I think that he would be on the fast track that he is now. I didn't, you always think this guy's going to be good or that guy's going to be good when they get experience. But at 15 years old, I saw something special in him in the ring when he would wrestle. And I figured I was very hesitant to use him at the age of 16 because that's really young for a person's body to perform in wrestling. It's a very physical sport. But once he was 16, he'd grown in size quite a bit. So when we gave him a chance, he more than met expectations. It's one of those rare wrestlers that comes along very few times in a decade or something like that you just see is going to have that potential to be a big star. And he's just one of those guys, and he's doing it right now. I mean, he's just everywhere he goes, he's so in demand right now. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. Did you say that he's Moondog Laredo's grandson?
Yes, he is.
I knew Moondog before he was in the business when I was wrestling in San Francisco, and I hadn't seen him since then until the Cauliflower Alley Club. And that's
he was he broke in with up in Northern California and San Francisco through Red Bastien.
Right.
Yeah, and he broke in during the last few years of Roy Shire's promotion.
Yeah. I think they're from
so
Haywood, aren't they?
I'm sorry, what's that?
Are they from Haywood, California?
Yes, originally he is.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Because I lived in the next town over. I lived in Fremont.
Oh, okay.
I was out there, yeah.
Oh, very cool. Very
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, and Ed, he traveled around a lot in the Northwest, worked in Kansas City, worked out there in Singapore, New Zealand for a time, a lot of Canada, like Al Tomko, things like that.
Right.
Worked for Don Owens for a long time. So yeah, he's been around himself. So, it's interesting.
Yeah.
As a third generation wrestler, he's around, Nick was around it since since he was a baby. They've got a ring in their garage, so you have a leg up on everybody else when you're in that position.
I believe that entirely. I mean, look at the Samoan dynasties. I mean, these guys, they just have that knack. Barry Windham and Wyatt, the Windham family. They're just incredible performers. And like you said, Matt, I think it's halfway that they've been around the business their whole life, you know what I mean? And understand it and get to go in the ring at a very early age.
Yeah, they become very familiar with it. I was really good friends with his dad, Buddy Wayne, and Buddy was a spectacular wrestler. At the time, he was a smaller guy during an era where a lot of the wrestlers were much bigger. So he was always one of those really underrated guys that was in the industry where you'd see him and you're like, oh my gosh, this guy's like Bobby Eaton, I used to always compare him to Bobby Eaton and how he works. And he was just a great wrestler. But he was stuck in the Pacific Northwest. He didn't travel around a lot. So nationally, his talents weren't as appreciated as others, but very great wrestler. Turned out to be an excellent trainer. He's trained a lot of great guys like Darby Allin, Clark Connors with New Japan Pro Wrestling. Guys like that are his students. And, it's something that he would watch wrestling all the time. So his son's watching wrestling all the time,
right.
And he'd watch wrestling from all around the world. Buddy and I would always talk about like lucha libre matches and things like that. And so Nick was being exposed to everything around the world. To this day, he talks to guys like Rip Rogers and boy, I can't remember his name, from the UK, Pete Roberts and things like that from the UK. So you're learning a lot from people around the world.
Yeah.
Kevin, I know you also love that venue you were talking about. You were pumping it up, that Defy uses, Washington Hall.
Yeah, the venue you guys have is spectacular. It's just spectacular. JP, it's Is it a historical landmark?
It is, yes.
Yeah.
A lot of old bands like guys like Jimi Hendrix and stuff played there years ago. So it's a it's a small like theater type auditorium, I would say. Like, you know, it's got a balcony around it. It reminds me a lot of like a lot of older wrestling venues, you know, where they would have the multi layers, smaller buildings. About 800 people max could fit in there. So it and fortunately, being in Seattle, where Seattle is known as in our sports teams, some of the loudest fans in the nation, and every event they bring it. They bring their energy. They bring that loudness. A lot of wrestlers that haven't been there before, that it's their first time experiencing the venue, they always come up and remark to me how loud the crowd is. And so that makes it really special for the wrestlers there too.
Kevin, you're on mute. You're muted, Kevin. We missed what you said there. But I love it. It looks so intimate. Like, it looks just the look of it is awesome. Just the way it's set up, basically.
Yeah, and it's a cool venue where everybody in the venue has, like, whether you're in the balcony or on the floor, it can fit a good amount of people, but at the same time, even when it's completely full, you feel like you're right by the ring, which adds a lot to it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's one of my favorite venues, and it really, you know, there's something special about the place for sure.
And the next two shows in November, December are going to be in the same place, Washington Hall?
Correct. That's we do a lot of our regular shows there. That's where many of our main events take place at. We do run a lot in Portland and Tacoma and other towns in Washington. But this is our our home.
That's a good thing, right? To have, like the home
Yeah.
base. It's probably easier for recording and Fight TV and for the guys and everything. They're comfortable.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a little more difficult building to set up because the venue's on the second story, so you got to load the ring through a flight of stairs. But we run the building so often that it's everyone's familiar. Like, we know the staff. We have, everybody's familiar with how things work, so it makes it really easy.
Sorry about that, guys. I don't know how.
Hey, no problem. I just know, Kevin, I know you love that building. I knew you were raving about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and as I think I was cut off when I said their shows are as good as any shows in the country, and I mean that. And I don't mean just independent shows, because I don't look at them as an independent company. They're as good as any national company, and the fans are the most rabid fans anywhere, and they rightfully should be, because they give them a mix of, my thing, JP, is it's like the circus. If you don't like this act, the next act is going to be the jugglers or the sword swallowers. I mean, they give them a little bit of everything, and it's based upon Jim and Matt's idea of keeping it in the realm of willing suspension of disbelief, that you can take it as a sport. It's very, very, and it's very entertaining too. The two, are they Brazilian guys that you have come out and they do the dance and the people get with it?
Oh, the Bollywood boys. No, they're from India.
Yeah, India.
Yeah. Those
out.
guys, they just came off of a 5-year run with WWE, and they're guys that, nationally they're known for their run with WWE, but they've got so much charisma and they've got so much energy that I'm surprised that no one else hasn't jumped on them already. They did recently do a dark match with the AEW, so there's potential there, but they're a brother duo that I'm just like, I just scratch my head why more people aren't looking at these guys because they've got it all. They're the full package. And like you said, Kevin, the energy they bring to the audience,
Yeah.
that's hard to replicate. And it's something that you just can't make up. They've got to have that charisma, that energy, that passion to do that. So those guys, Harv and Gerv, are great at that.
And they come out dancing. The whole audience dances with them. They run up to the balcony and dance with the people. A lot of high energy. And it isn't just them. He had Eddie Kingston there, and the people were going crazy over Eddie. I mean, they have everybody from A to Z. And like I said, it's the happiest dressing room I've ever been in.
Yeah, we had Kevin himself involved in a three-way tag team match, and from the moment a local wrestler Shaft came out, the place just exploded, and it was just like a wildfire of action and just people flying all over the place. And yeah, it was great. It was great.
You guys do have a pretty good roster too, outside of some of the guys we named. Christopher Daniels is always there. Swerve, I guess he's the champion, if you will. So I mean, you guys got a lot of good talent, even well-known international talent, consistently on your shows.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Christopher Daniels, was our champion for nearly a year. He just recently lost it to Swerve, and Swerve was one of those guys that nearly 6 years ago we, for our very first event ever, we brought Swerve out. He's from the Pacific Northwest, but being raised in the military, he was actually living in Florida at the time. But we saw something in that guy. We were like, this guy's got something. When he was very young, and we were like, this is a guy we could build the company around. And, we decided to do that. And since that time, he's one of those kind of guys that loves wrestling, loves Defy, loves what Seattle helped do for him early in his career. And he likes to come back and compete in front of these fans. So despite being that big star in AEW, he still enjoys coming back to Seattle and working for Defy. And he always represents our company and wrestling in the greatest way. He's going to, mark my words, in a year from now in AEW, he's going to be one of their top 5 guys. I really believe that.
He's when I first met him, I met him at PCW Ultra. And I was shocked at how good he was back then. That had been 4 or 5 years ago, and he had been with you guys maybe a year. And this, I agree with you, Matt, 100%. This guy is going to be a big, huge star for AEW. Can I switch the questions just a little? Matt, how did you get, because there's a lot of people in wrestling. JP is a historian. Not many people get into the historical part. How did you get so invested in the historical part of wrestling?
I think it really started at a young age. I started getting some books on wrestling, and 30, 40 years ago, there weren't a lot of books about pro wrestling. I think the first pro wrestling book I got was Whatever Happened to Gorgeous George.
Yeah. Which
was written by a former wrestler named Joe Jars, whose son traveled around a little bit with, or he actually traveled around with Gorgeous George. Yeah, his dad, sorry, it was his father who traveled with Gorgeous George. So I read that book, and it really made me think about it in historical terms. And then, like a lot of young people, I grew up watching with my grandfather, who had followed wrestling through World War II and things like that, and would always talk to me about these older wrestlers that I wasn't familiar with, but I was always interested to hear about. So I was always interested to learn about them. Then when I got more serious into wrestling in my teens, I would go to shows down in Portland at the Portland Sports Arena. Me and my buddy, we'd find ways to get down there. And I was introduced to this guy named Mike Rogers, who wrote a newsletter called Ring Around the Northwest. And in Ring Around the Northwest, he would interview wrestlers who had some kind of an impact on the Northwest working for Don Owen. And so I'd read these, and in each newsletter, he would have results of shows, and I was always fascinated by those results. Getting to know Mike Rogers, I learned that he would go to like libraries and research microfilms of old shows, like historical shows, or just get results for the year because the newspapers would print them. So I started doing that. Then I was introduced to J. Michael Kenyon, who's one of the godfathers of wrestling history. I also back then there was like this weird underground tape trading and newsletter like scene where you could write people from all around the world. Like I would write letters to Dave Cameron, who's from Australia, like a famous historian from Australia, who's got like a huge, almost a museum like house. Same with Tom Burke.
Right.
And then there was guys like Don Luke and, just tons of historians that I'd reach out to. And even as a young kid, some of them would write back and I'd learn a lot from them. Dr. Robert Bryla, who was one of the original like historians from like the 50s and 60s. And so it just over time, it was just something that really caught my attention. And so guys like J. Michael Kenyon, who was a newspaper writer and also a wrestling historian, they would teach me things about wrestling history that you wouldn't learn from just reading it in newspapers.
Right.
J. Michael Kenyon was a good friend of Lou Thesz's. So, those guys, they had like an inside track on the business. Same with Tom Burke, he was good friends with a lot of pro wrestlers.
Right.
So he would pick up a lot of different things. And that was just always something that interested me. And, originally my focus was on wrestling in the Pacific Northwest, but then as time grew, it just expanded to the entire world of wrestling, So I've really taken the time to learn about wrestling in other cultures, other countries. Every time I bring it up, people are just awestruck with how big professional wrestling was in the 1900s in other parts of the world. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. You mentioned Tom Burke at the Cauliflower Alley Club. Tom sent me some stuff. It was a 1953 full-page article about wrestling, and it was the original paper he sent me. And I did stump Tom one time. And JP, I've talked to you about at one time there was a promoter that was probably as powerful in his day as Vince Jr. was Paul Bowser.
Yep.
Yeah, and I told Tom that when I was a kid, I saw the NWA champion. They didn't announce him as the NWA champion. And in Boston area, Killer Kowalski was the AWA champion, the original AWA. And he did a job in the middle of the ring for Kowalski. He said, "Oh, it never happened." He pulled it up and he had it on a sheet. And
Wow.
I stumped Tom for the first time. But Paul Bowser's territory, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, and you would know. He owned part of Toronto. He placed Eddie Quinn in Montreal. He owned all of New England. He owned part of the New York office with Toots Montt and Vince. He owned part of Ohio with Haft. He had a percentage in both NWA offices in Chicago with Kohler and Schwartz.
Schwartz,
He placed guys in both San Francisco and LA, and they all defended his belt. But he was a member of the NWA.
Very powerful guy, and a lot of...
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no problem. A lot of people don't understand how big that world championship was. Some people refer to it as the AWA championship or the Montreal world title, but because Montreal at that time was hugely successful. It was just one of those territories and one of those cities that just consistently drew huge numbers.
Can I interrupt you real quick, Matt?
For sure, yes.
Wouldn't you think that Montreal, since at least the 40s, has at one time was the wrestling capital in North America?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, there were plenty of times when it was probably the hottest city in the in North America. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Especially when Kowalski was world champion.
Right.
There were some periods there where they were running at the stadium in the summer. I don't know how to pronounce it. What is it? Delamore Stadium in Montreal. They would run that in the stadium instead of the Forum, and it was nothing for them to draw 20,000 people outside with like Kowalski or Kaninsky, guys like that, that were coming up there all the time, and they were just doing tremendous business.
Yeah. JP, you know how I always say the connection between wrestling and boxing? During that era in Montreal, I looked at results from Montreal wrestling. I think it was 1957. And that summer, every title match in the main event was refereed by a former heavyweight boxing champion, whether it was Joe Louis, Joe Walcott, Rocky Marciano. The only ones that weren't heavyweights, they had Yvonne Durrell, who fought Archie Moore, one of the greatest fights of all times, the first Archie Moore, Yvonne Durrell fight. He knocked Archie Moore down 3 times in the first round before they had the, three knockdowns, the fight was stopped. He knocked him down numerous times during that fight, and Archie Moore himself. So, I mean, the boxing and wrestling tie-in, because Montreal was also a great boxing town.
Very much. Yeah, Eddie Quinn had a lot of ties into boxing, and well, he had a lot of ties. But yeah, Eddie Quinn is one of those. He's another guy like with Paul Bowser, who was a very powerful promoter. At times, he wielded a lot of weight in the NWA. And he backed a lot of the NWA champions like Lou Thesz for a long time. So, which is one of the reasons why Lou Thesz was so powerful, was because of his relationship with Eddie Quinn.
And didn't he back Carpentier too? And that was when they did the title switch.
Yes, yeah. Eddie Quinn was I believe, Carpentier's manager, so he actually had a piece of Carpentier's career. So,
JP, you know that? Did you? I wanted to bring JP into this. JP, did you know that they had a title switch with Bez, which split the title in the country in '57?
Yep, unrecognized though, right? They don't recognize Carpentier as the champion?
They don't in the record books, but half the. Am I right that half the country recognized them, and the referee was Jack Dempsey?
Wow.
Yeah, and it's strange they don't recognize him on paper.
Yeah,
but they recognized him internally on paper because the NWA title was being defended by 2 separate champions simultaneously. It was something they did, which everybody knew about. Not everybody was happy about it, but when Sam Muchnick wrote the history of the NWA World Championship, he didn't include it, but that was just to keep people from asking questions, right? That was just for public viewing, but internally they recognized it. So I think he should be recognized as a world champion, NWA world champion, of course.
Yeah, I do too.
But again, guys like when Kowalski was AWA world champion in many of the major markets in the country, he was just as popular, or just as credible as Thesz was, or or Pat O'Connor was as NWA world champion.
Wow, yeah.
It's funny, like through the history, who was champion, who really, like Inoki, technically, Kev, we were talking about that, former WWF champion, unrecognized. I know some of Baba's reigns do get recognized, maybe some don't. There's random guy, Jack Veneno, that guy Kev, you mentioned a few weeks ago, that random guy from like Singapore or whatever heck that beat Flair. I mean, there's so many guys.
Yeah, I was in a show, Matt, in Singapore, where the promoter from New Zealand, Steve Rickard, beat Ric Flair. And the next night he dropped it to him a couple of nights later.
Yeah. Were you we might have lost Kevin, but I wonder, was Kevin, were you on that tour where Flair and Harley Race did the title switch?
We lost Kevin. We'll get him back. I do wonder if he was. We'll find out if he was on the tour. I'm just fascinated by that. Sometimes is that like through being historian. I mean, I feel like I know stuff, and then I meet guys like you, and you're like, "Holy crap, this guy knows so much." But do they do that because something happened internally? They didn't like the returns. They like somebody disagreed with it. Why does that happen? Or did maybe they got paid off? So
Yeah,
hey,
there's lots of reasons why. It could be something as simple as a guy wanting to be testy, or take a guy like Gene Kiniski. He was one of the most successful NWA world champions, but he didn't like the NWA really. He didn't like the politics behind it. He didn't like a lot of the promoters. So it could have been simply as a guy got a wild hair and decided to mess with somebody,
right?
Or maybe they felt that person was being too pushy, or they felt that Sam was being tough to deal with or something, and decided to like mess with him a little bit,
It's funny. I interviewed Kelly Kiniski. He was saying Gene is kind of like the forgotten NWA champion. I mean, he beat Fez, but for God's sakes, he was kind of forgotten for a little bit. Oddly,
it's sad that Gene Kiniski is not remembered more today, because that guy was a fantastic world champion in terms of box office. I know a lot of people later on in life didn't care for him when he was part of, when he had part of the Office in Vancouver, but in terms of like being a box office sensation, he was a big star and he was a big draw. And during those years as NWA World Champion, he was as successful as anybody in that position.
Kevin, were you on that show with Flair and Race when they switched the title?
The one in Greensboro?
No, the one in when they did the title switch in New Zealand and Singapore.
No, I wasn't.
Oh, yeah. I know we talked about him earlier, but Ed Moondog Moretti, he was on that tour, and he actually wrestled Flair one of the nights for the World Championship in Singapore. But that was a situation that was supposed to be one of those unrecognized title switches, but Paul Bosch just happened to be on vacation and stooged him off, so that's how they found out about it.
Really?
And also Japanese photographers were there too, so they took pictures of the title change, so the Office found out about it.
Wow, that's funny.
Yeah.
There's like a phantom, what's that guy? Victor Jovica, Carlos Colon, Jack Veneno. There's all these random ones. I mean, unrecognized, of course. The Midnight Rider supposedly won it in Florida. I mean,
no, he did. I was involved. That was my angle.
But did it actually is it a part of the record book, or just is it ignored?
No, it's not part of the record book, and here's why. It was my angle with Dusty, and Dusty, I beat Dusty, so he had to leave town. Then the Midnight Rider appeared, and he was booked with Rick. And I said, I got a great idea, I think. You win the title, you don't have to show your face to anybody, but the NWA president has to know who it really is. And then Geigel, he had it for about a week on TV and everything, and then Geigel sent it a tape. Yeah, you can. Nobody else needs to know, but I need to know who you are. And there'd be no suspension if it happened to be Dusty Rhodes. And he had to give the belt back, so it kept the heat with me and him going. And it gave Dusty a great win over Rick, you know what I mean? And we had a finish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that always makes, because there was always that bylaw that the world champion can't be masked, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, and that's one of the things that a lot of people forget too, is that those world championships were pretty much just it was a tool to draw money, right? So that's what it was about, right? That was the whole idea of having a world champion, was to run angles with, to draw money.
right, right. You know, there's another guy, and I think he was the National Wrestling Association champion. Matt, you probably know Wild Bill Longston.
Yes.
He was really the first out and out heel, JP, that was the world champion. And he drew nothing but money during the Depression.
Yeah. Yeah, probably in the late 30s and early 40s was probably the biggest box office star in the country.
Right.
Especially in St. Louis. Wow, he drew just tons of sellouts there. But yeah, massive star.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
just saw.
his son's still alive and was pretty active in the historical circles for a while there, and so he was able to share a lot of the information from his dad.
Oh, that's great. Great. What were you
I
going to
was
say,
going to say,
JP?
so Big Dave Meltzer, he put out a picture of Jim Londos and one of the arenas. Holy crap! There had to be, I'd say, 50,000 people, or maybe even more in this picture. It's like, wow, what a card! He was saying what a draw Jim Londos was during that era as well.
Matt, am I
Yes, there.
wrong? Am I wrong? He happened to be a cousin of my dad, Steve Crusher Casey. He actually beat Lou
Wow.
Thez for the AWA belt. Him
Hmm.
and Lundus wrestled in Braves Field when the Braves were in Boston, and they drew 38,000 people. So
Yeah.
the stadium shows aren't a brand new thing. They've been doing it for 50 years, 60 years, 70 years.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, easily. Yeah, Londos has headlined tons of stadium shows. I mean, dozens and dozens of them. And running outdoors in baseball parks was pretty common during the summer months, of course, in a lot of territories. But here's a guy that would draw stadium-sized crowds for years. Um, in his home country of Athens, Greece, he's
Yeah.
headlined at least 5 events at the Olympic Stadium there in Athens, which has a capacity of about 80,000 people. And at least one of those times he sold it out. The other times were probably around 50 to 70,000 people. I believe the crowd you're talking about with the photo with Dave that he was talking about was in front of like 50,000 people in Athens, Greece. And
Yeah.
he was such a massive star. If you were probably to name the biggest box office draw in pro wrestling, you'd have to say either Jim Londos or Hulk Hogan. It'd be between those two guys in terms of longevity and crowds drawn and things like that. So, I mean, just a massive star.
Yeah. And
Kevin, you have a great line about Hulkster that I absolutely love that you told your daughter.
which one was that? About the seats?
No, about praying.
Oh yeah. I used to, when my daughter was a kid, I used to tell her, when you're saying your prayers, say one for Hulk, because he's the one that's giving you this lifestyle. So, yeah, but the thing about Londos too is he was a great manipulator. He had manipulated a bunch of times in the office, especially in New York with Toots Mondt and the Goldust Trio, and there was a lot of infighting in those times, JP. The promoters would switch on each other and then a month later be back as partners sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. And the championship itself wielded a lot of power because it was almost like a license to print money. So it was a very protected entity. And there was all those titles being moved off and very Wild West days. But a guy like Londos, he was so impactful on the industry. Like when he left New York, after issues with promoters, I mean, the city died, and it took a while for it to come back in terms of wrestling popularity. He wielded a lot of power. But you know, I don't know of a top star who wasn't political in some ways, right, Kevin? I mean, that's kind of comes with the territory.
You're absolutely, and I may be wrong, but when Jim Blundus left New York, I think there was no wrestling in Madison Square Garden for 12 years.
Correct.
It had gone down to the bottom.
Yep, and even when they did come back, they came back with Gorgeous George, and it didn't draw.
Yeah.
You know, it took a few more years until Antonino Rocca came in, and really helped out a lot, and that was with the Johnston family.
Right. They were in the fights too. They were big time fight promoters too. So that thing that I always say to you, JP, about us being kissing cousins, boxing and wrestling, we really were kissing cousins back in those days.
Was Jess McMahon
very much.
promoting
He was
Jess McMahon promoting Madison Square Garden?
Yeah, I'll
not he did help in Madison Square Garden, but he was at that time, a few years earlier, he would have been the partner of Tex Ricard, who actually owned a piece of Madison Square Garden and was the boxing promoter there. So Jess would usually run some of the smaller clubs in the city, but was his partner working in Madison Square Garden. But yeah, they mostly did boxing, but they did dabble in pro wrestling.
So the McMahons could come up on 100 years in a row of booking MSG pretty soon anyway.
Yeah.
Not the one now, but the original ones.
Yeah.
I believe we're on the 4th Madison Square Garden now. You know, the original one, you know, this is the nerd part of me coming out, but the original one was built in like 1888 after it was renamed from Gilmore Gardens. And then it sat there for years, and it held about 10,000 people. But, you know, some of the early pro wrestling matches that were huge successes in this country were held at the Gilmore Gardens or the original Madison Square Garden. And I've always been fascinated by that because, you know, that was before automotives and things like that. So it's like, I always wonder how 10,000 people going to an arena would look like, because everybody would be walking. It's such a fascinating thing to me, especially to see these stars, you know, from that era, and you see these huge crowds and you're like, wow, how did all these people even get to the arena? You know, because automobiles weren't a thing, and how did they even light the arena? You know, it's so fascinating to me.
Yeah, I never thought about that, but it is, that's for sure. And then there was JP on Long Island. There was Madison Square Garden Bowl, which is an outside venue, and they had wrestling there.
Yeah, very famous building. That's where the famous John J. Braddock fight happened, where he beat was it Max Baer?
Yeah, Max Baer and Braddock. Yeah, the Cinderella Man.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that was where that famous fight took place at.
Yeah.
Wow, you know your history, maybe even more than Kevin, which is surprising.
No, he
I
does.
doubt it.
No, I take my hat off to him. I mean, I think he may even know more than a mutual friend, Tom Burke. Tom knows a lot of history, but he's really specializes in the New England, Montreal area, where a friend on the show today knows everything.
Yeah, Tom is a special guy. He's a really cool guy. And I believe he was friends with Tony Santos, right? Who was the promoter in Boston for a long time.
Yeah.
So, you know, and Kevin knows this too, is a lot of the knowledge comes from learning from people. And so you sit down with a veteran, or you ride with somebody who has all this knowledge, and that's really where you learn a lot of this information from. You know, it's like with Kevin himself, he's been exposed to so many people over the years. You've had an opportunity to learn these things from people, which makes you, so knowledgeable in the business and the industry. It's amazing.
Yeah, and you get to also know, like you talk to Tom, well, he'll tell you stuff that was very important that not many people knew. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
About why Santos didn't push for TV, because he was trying to keep
Mhm.
a low profile because he was racing horses that were doped up. So he didn't, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's an interesting, there's always a sidebar to these stories of early days in wrestling.
Yeah.
What a crazy business, mafia like to some degree.
Well, they used to, some of the big time people when wrestling was hot in the 50s had control of the athletic commissions. So when they were counting tickets, it was 1 for them, 3 for us, 1 for them, 5 for us.
Yeah.
Seems very mafioso. A lot of
Yes.
this stuff.
Yes. Yeah.
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 Very much.
But as we wind it down here, we head towards the finish. Give us all the info on Defy Wrestling, where everybody can find it, and what we could look forward to, because I know you got a bunch of shows coming up before the end of the year.
We do. We've got a bunch of shows in Seattle. For the rest of the year, we're going to be just running events in Washington Hall in Seattle. So have an event this Saturday at Washington Hall. It's sold out, but you could watch it live on Fight, which is available on all platforms. It's going to be at 8 p.m. Pacific time. Main events Minoru Suzuki and Tom Lawler. Then November 26th, we'll be back at Washington Hall for another event. And then to close out the year, we're going to do a show in December 17th, back at Washington Hall. So information for those two events you could see at defywrestling.com or check us out on social media at DefyNW. This weekend's event, we're really looking forward to it. We've got a lot of things on tap. We have a lot of things that we haven't even, that aren't public yet that will happen or take place. So we always like to offer a few surprises too.
Nice.
Well, it was great having you as a guest, and I'm speaking for both of us. It was a learning, sitting under your learning tree was really interesting, Matt. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate our talks. So enjoy it.
Too. Thank you, JP.
Yes, thank you. Of course, you can follow Kevin on Instagram at Taskmaster Talks. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at 2Man Power Trip. Check out the website tmptempire.com. Kevin, anything else you got going on?
Well, I'm as you know, I'm in Florida. I'm been on a fishing expedition, but I'm actually gonna do a territorial thing Tuesday for the Vice and Rocks company. It's about the Grams.
Nice.
Very cool.
I'll be filming that. And last night they had the Florida episode on, and it was me, Steve Kern, Bob Roop, Brian Blair, and Jerry Briscoe. It was very interesting. I guess I didn't get to see it on TV, but I was there live, so I can remember it.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
Is it Dark Side of the Ring, though, that Eddie Graham thing, or is it another Tales of the Territory?
It's Dark Side of the Ring.
Nice. All right, cool.
Wow, that'll be
looking forward to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Very
got
cool.
Tales of the Territory on my DVR, so I got to check out that that episode. But thank you to
thank you guys.
Will do. Yep. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah,
thank you,
you.
Matt. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Appreciate it.
Right back here next week for a little Taskmaster Talks with Kevin Sullivan. We'll see you next week, folks.